All right,
Okay,
thank
great.
you so much. Okay, perfect. Thank you everyone for your patience. This is just the the woes of I mean, it's fantastic to be here with all of you today, um, and that we're in many different parts of the country, maybe even of the world. And then it can also be challenging to figure out this technology stuff, but it looks like we're on our way. So first, I want to say gracias. Thank you for the invitation. I also wanted to say that if you have questions as I'm talking, feel free to submit the question. If I can, I'll integrate it into what I'm saying. I was telling Daris that I wish we had 2 more hours so that I could really get more into things to do with treatment around human trafficking, which unfortunately I won't be able to get into deeply today, but we were talking about maybe in the future doing another presentation that's only focused on treatment. Today I'm going to be giving you an overview of human trafficking, how I define it and how other people in the field are defining it, and also what it looks like, and what it looks like both for people who have been affected by it here in the United States, and then also and people who were born and raised here in the United States, and then also what it looks like for people who have been brought from other countries. My focus is Latino America, because I work with people, when I work internationally, I work primarily with people from Latin America. I'm originally Guatemalteca, and I've been in the United States for a while now, but I very much moved between those two countries, between the region of Centro America and here in the United States. So let me move right around here. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. The first thing that I wanted to talk to you about was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was passed in 2000 for the first time, and then there were numerous reauthorizations. Now, this is a very important law that really brought us to a point in the United States where we could start offering services and protections to victims of human trafficking. So I'm all for it. Now, here's the caveat, is that it's also been lacking in many ways. So the legal definition of trafficking has been lacking in many ways to meet the needs of people who have survived this kind of experience. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today are issues that, while maybe they're considered legally, they're not always fleshed out legally as well as they should be. And so it can make it very hard to serve people who've had these experiences properly. One of the reasons that human trafficking is difficult to define is because it's not an isolated issue. And in fact, it involves multiple people. And so there are people who have had the experience of being victimized by another person, a trafficker, or a seller. And then there are also buyers. This is what's referred to in the field as the creation of demand. And then there's also society, and how society is reacting to the issue of human trafficking, and how society is understanding it. Also related to human trafficking, something that I've thought about a lot, and this is really important in the development of services for people who've had these experiences, is what language do we use? So you may have heard, for instance, of the word modern day slavery. It's a term that derived from human trafficking, as did also domestic minor sex trafficking, and also commercial sex exploitation. So these three terms, they're commonly used interchangeably with the term human trafficking. And there seems to be, in the literature and also in practice, there seems to be a general consensus that it's okay to use them interchangeably. However, we also have these other terms, slavery and prostitution, that are sometimes used interchangeably with human trafficking. And there's actually much less consensus about if and when it's appropriate to use slavery and prostitution interchangeably with human trafficking. And so I'm going to try to deconstruct why I think it's important to critically integrate both of these terms into our understanding of human trafficking. So, about prostitution and human trafficking. So first, to understand the connections between prostitution and trafficking, I want to take a step back and do a more general breakdown of what is human trafficking. So human trafficking, it can be domestic, that is occurring within US borders, and this type of human trafficking will not always involve the transportation of a person who's being victimized in this way. International trafficking will always involve transportation of a person from another country, usually from an economically deprived country to a wealthier country. So that's how the route usually goes. And exploitation in human trafficking, it can be for manual labor, or it can be for exploitation in the sex industry. And so when it's for manual labor, the exploitation is termed labor trafficking. And when it's in the sex industry, that's when exploitation is termed as sex trafficking. So each of these, labor and sex trafficking, they have a list of associated terms. And there is general consensus that work exploitation, debt bondage, and domestic servitude are also forms of exploitation that can be used interchangeably with labor trafficking. Now, in the case of sex trafficking, it's not so simple. Their domestic minor sex trafficking and commercial sex exploitation, they're both commonly used interchangeably with sex trafficking, as I talked about just a moment ago. Prostitution and sex work, however, though they're associated to trafficking in different ways, they're sometimes used interchangeably with the term sex trafficking, but there's a lot of debate around that practice. I'm not really going to get too much into the debate because I don't really think it's crucial for what I do, what my focus is, which is helping treat people who have been deeply impacted by the experience of human trafficking, both of sex and labor trafficking. But I will name it a little bit insofar that it can affect treatment at times. So a little bit about society. So you might be wondering why the debate? Why the debate? So why is there so much debate around trafficking and prostitution? So it is indisputable that there are women and girls that are being exploited within both legal and illegal sex industries here in the United States and globally. And so this is what several international reports point to over and over again, including the latest UN report on trafficking in persons. So then why is there all this effort to distinguish between prostitution and sex trafficking? So it seems like a part of the answer is in the societal attitudes that people have towards prostitution versus sex trafficking. There's this very interesting study by Silver, Carricker, and Boyson, where they intended to identify the predictors of pro-social behavior towards sex-trafficked women. And the undergraduate students that participated in the study, they were provided with vignettes, one of a sex-trafficked, indisputably exploited woman who was controlled by a trafficker, and the other was a vignette of a woman who prostituted and without any signs that she was controlled by a third person or trafficker. And so then participants were provided with follow-up questions to measure their level of empathy, their just world beliefs, and their attitudes towards prostitution, and also one additional measure on proactive behavior. And these were the author's general findings. So trafficked foreign women received the highest empathy, and US prostitutes received the least. And so path analysis indicated that just world beliefs, so a belief that the world is just, plus beliefs about prostitutes, plus family values relating to prostitution, all three of those had a direct effect on empathic concern. In turn, empathic concern had a direct effect on proactive behaviors. And so the findings, what they suggest is that the participants were willing to do a lot for one group, trafficked women, but very little to nothing for the other group, US prostitutes. And so based on how underserviced and marginalized of a group people in prostitution have generally been a marginalized and underserviced group, I think these results, they accurately reflect how much we want to force ourselves into thinking that when we're talking about sex trafficking, we're actually not talking about prostitution, because as a society, we've developed a narrative that goes something like this, that sex trafficking victims are good and they're worthy of our efforts, and that we have an imperative to address their needs and the injustices that they suffer. And that on the other hand, and I'm not saying that anyone in this room thinks in this specific way, but I'm talking just the social narrative in general, that on the other hand, prostitutes are seen as bad people who chose a bad path, and therefore they don't deserve our efforts and support. And so this here, in my opinion, is one of the major definitional issues that we're contending with when we're trying to develop services for people who've had experiences of sex trafficking. And so the question is, who are we including in those services? So perhaps what happens sometimes, and this is what I've seen happening in a lot of program development, is we open programs and we say, these programs are for people who have been trafficked, and then the referrals don't come. Because actually, and you'll see why, most people who are having this kind of experience of exploitation, they would more readily identify themselves as being in prostitution than as being trafficked. And so a lot of the consultation that I give is that when we open up services for people who have been trafficked, when we're thinking about specifically about developing services for people who've been sex trafficked, that we have to cast a wide net and engage people in commercial sex more broadly. And then once we've engaged those groups, that there we can find out who is actually identifying, feeling like, considering or wanting to exit prostitution and being trafficked and having a hard time with the exit process. I also wanted to say that there also seems to be a very similar yet much less contentious divide that would likely be identified if Carrickert and colleagues conducted the same study for labor trafficking and looked at it under the lens of immigration. So social discourse suggests that there would be far more empathic concern for US-born workers and documented immigrants subjected to labor exploitation, and that said exploitation would be more easily termed as labor trafficking, but that less empathic concern would likely exist towards undocumented immigrants who are viewed, unfortunately, as people who are breaking the law, as taking US citizen jobs. So it reminds me of a young girl that I evaluated not too long ago who was trafficked from Centro America to the US South when she was 15 years old. She was forced to work harvesting produce. There were days when after finishing her work in the fields, she was taken to a warehouse to continue working. And some days she would work for 20-hour shifts. And so this young girl was also being raped by one of the people who had trafficked her. And she explained to me that she tried to tell people, she tried to tell strangers sometimes about the abuse that she was suffering, but that nobody listened. And what she said to me, and these are her words translated into English by me, she said, "I think nobody wanted to help me because they thought that what was happening to me was my fault. I'd come here illegally, and so maybe people here think that I deserved what was happening to me." And so this thought is actually what drove this young girl into deep isolation for years, because she didn't come to the attention of anyone until she was 22 years old. And because of these negative assumptions that she had heard being talked about socially, and that she had effectively taken in, and that they were working against her getting any help. And well, actually, also she had tried to get help and hadn't been assisted, and so gave up for a long time. So to further deconstruct the sex trafficking and prostitution debate, I think it's, and this is the last thing that I'll say about this debate, it's important to talk for a moment about the sex work model, which is supported by many sex work advocates who view sex trafficking and prostitution as two completely separate, unconnected industries. Elrod explains in their research this divide really well. So in this conceptualization of the industries, all those who engage in prostitution do so by their own choice. In contrast, a victim of sex trafficking has not made a choice to participate in the industry. So this victim is there completely against her will and controlled by a trafficker. It's not only a she, it can be a he, it can be a they, it can be a person of any gender. Therefore, sex work advocates argue that equating prostitution and sex trafficking doesn't recognize the possibility of a person's choice to participate in commercial sex work. Elrod explains, however, that, and I'll quote him directly here, that any form of commercial transaction for sex leads to an increase in market demand for sexual services. So this demand for sexual services creates a profit motive, he says, that encourages individuals, including traffickers, to provide commercial sexual services. So given the nature of the industry and established practices, traffickers often resort to exploitive tactics in order to find sex partners to meet this demand. Thus, Elrod says, as the prostitution industry as a whole goes, so goes sex trafficking. So, basically he's saying this prostitution industry, the way that it's organized, the way that demand functions, is actually pushing for traffickers to fuel it with people who are there not by choice, but who are coerced into the industry. And so that's a problem that needs to be addressed if we are going to address the issue of human trafficking. I'm going to transition now to talk for a moment about the overlaps between trafficking and historical slavery. Orlando Patterson, a slavery scholar whose work I follow very closely, makes an important connection between historical slavery and human trafficking, noting, and this is really important for all those people who are undocumented, people moving under duress, who have fallen prey. So Patterson says that today to human traffickers, what Patterson says that traditional alienation, natal alienation, bears its closest ties with people illegally transported by traffickers from their home country to a destination country to be exploited. So this is very much the case of international victims of human trafficking in the US. So when undocumented people are victimized, they understandably fear turning to law enforcement for protection due to their undocumented status. And so fear of law enforcement also applies for other groups who've been historically persecuted by law enforcement, such as women and girls in the sex industry, which multiple police departments across the country, and actually in my own state where I work here in the United States, in Massachusetts, is making an attempt to remedy this by engaging more empathically with this population. Undocumented immigrants trafficked into the United States, they're lacking documents and they're lacking state protection. And so they're forced into a state of isolation where they continue to be exploited. What Patterson explains is that over time, this isolation becomes a form of social death that renders the person invisible to others. I think the case that I just talked to you about is a very good example of that. And so I believe that with slavery and human trafficking, as a society, we're also trying to make a similar divide as we do with prostitution and sex trafficking. That is, we try to separate human trafficking from its connections to slavery. And I think it happens because we're constantly trying to forget, disavow, and repress the unresolved issues that US society continues to struggle with in relation to its history of slavery. And maybe we feel that as a society, we don't know how to work through the hurt and the consequences of slavery, but that here is this new issue of human trafficking that we can do something about. However, in order to gain a definition of human trafficking that can respond to all the complex issues that it houses, we need to make the effort to integrate all its contributing factors, as uncomfortable as that may feel sometimes, because it helps us understand that the issue is complex. It helps us understand that it's deeply rooted in historical factors that came to coalesce with modern issues. And so with that, now I'm going to transition to some of those modern issues that fuel human trafficking today. And I'm going to talk about it both for US citizens and what it looks like for people that are brought from other countries. And I will focus on Latino America and people coming from Latin America. So structural factors. Read this study. It's a little bit dated at this point, but I every time that I review it, it continues to be, I think, the study that most accurately describes what are the push factors. What are the factors that contribute to trafficking? It's very comprehensive. It's a meta-analysis of multiple other studies. So I think it's very reliable. These are very reliable findings. So some structural factors are economies that are reliant on the sex industry, lacking in educational opportunities for children, where pimping culture is valued, and also that in contrast with the devaluation of women and children. About demand on sex buyers, I also wanted to talk a little bit about that. That sex purchasing does drive up human trafficking. And there are prevalent studies of demand that found, and this study, and I'm sorry that I didn't include the citation here, this is Rosipovitz and colleagues, 2019 study, so pretty recent. And they studied they studied sex purchasing and found that among adult men in the United States, it was roughly 4 million men a year who purchased sex. However, the rate of sex buying could still easily reach 10 million transactions, as more than half of sex buyers reported purchasing sex more than once in the recent past. And research that studies the behaviors and attitudes of sex buyers has found that this group was more likely than men who did not buy sex to report sexual aggression, likelihood to rape, engage in impersonal sex, exhibit hostile masculinity, and to show less empathy for women in prostitution, who they generally considered as different from other women. And that those were actually studies carried out by Farley and colleagues in 2017. And then there are other studies showing high rates of sex buyer violence and high rates of demand to purchase sex, which increases the trafficking of people to commercial sex. And this is what has led many advocacy groups, which you'll hear about if you're following what's going on in this field, Those findings have led many advocacy groups to focus on the prosecution of sex buyers as a more effective anti-trafficking agenda, given the enormous challenges that there are to prosecute traffickers. That's directly from studies by Criswell in 2019 and Niemi and Alaton in 2017. So now I'm going to talk for a little bit about some of the myths that exist about human trafficking. And for that, I wanted to bring your attention to the movie Taken. I don't know who's watched the movie Taken. I have watched it a couple of times. It was released in 2008, and then there's been a Taken 2 and a 3 that was released the following years. So this has been a very, very successful movie. And this movie, I think it was very effective in creating chatter about human trafficking. And I also believe that it helped some people become interested in the issue. However, a number of myths about human trafficking were also generated by Taken and other similar movies that came out. The movie mistakenly portrayed human trafficking as an issue that only affects women, that it's exclusively about forced prostitution, that the primary means of trafficking is kidnapping and abductions, that it only happens in other countries, that there are bad guys, traffickers who are always foreigners, and that there are good guys, the rescuers, who are US citizens, and that after people are rescued, they're very happy. So let's look at some of the facts to debunk these myths, which I think is really important. So who are the traffickers? What we know is that generally well, these are the myths: that they're male, that they all have criminal histories, that they're part of an organized crime network, and that they look scary. That I would know a trafficker just by seeing the person, and that the person would look scary. When in fact, traffickers can be actually of any gender, age, socioeconomic class status. They can be of any race, ethnicity. Anyone who profits by receiving cash or similar benefits from exploiting another person for sex or forced manual labor would be a trafficker. So a brothel business owner, a fake massage business owner, an employer of a domestic servant, criminal networks, crew leaders in agricultural work, pimps, intimate partners, family members, labor contractors, factory owners. These are all categories actually that were put out by the US Department of State in 2015 and in subsequent reports as well. People from all these categories have been identified as being traffickers. Regarding the relationship to the trafficker, in fact, in nearly half of all cases of human trafficking, the trafficker was actually someone that the victim already knew, and typically someone from his or her own community. And in the Americas, 80% of trafficking offenses were committed by national offenders. So this debunks the myth that it's always going to be a foreign person that's going to be a trafficker. It's usually a citizen of the same country where the person is trafficked. And regarding traffickers in gender, 43% of prosecutions and 67% of convictions for human trafficking were of female traffickers. And so that debunks the myth that all traffickers are male. Also related to traffickers, it's important to note that one of the reasons that trafficking is difficult to address from the law enforcement side is that it is, as I'll explain, a hard to detect and therefore a hard to prosecute crime. So here you see that most countries reported between 10 to 50 convictions of traffickers between 2010 to 2012. The US falls in the 16% of countries that reported more than 50 convictions of human traffickers. However, this number is still alarmingly low. So I've evaluated and worked with well over 100 people with histories of trafficking. And I know of but one prosecution actually that stemmed from those cases, from all of those cases that I've worked on. There's one prosecution, well, actually at this point, two prosecutions that I know happened. Globally, most detected cases are of citizens of the countries where they were identified. Therefore, human trafficking is not always characterized by movement of a person from one country to another. In the United States, trafficking includes both people who were brought from other countries to the US to be exploited, and it also includes US citizens who are exploited in the United States. And then regarding victims by sex and age, what multi-country data on trafficking shows that includes reporting on the US is that most victims are female, and that of this group, most are adult women, but girl victims are increasing too. Also important is that trafficking is typically not a person's first trauma. So what studies estimate is that as many as 70% of women involved in prostitution are trafficked into commercial sex in early adolescence. So the average age of entry into commercial sex or prostitution is between 11 to 14 years of age. And that youth most at risk for commercial sexual exploitation for monetary or non-monetary gain are those who are runaways, homeless, or children in or leaving foster homes. And so you know that for kids who are in foster homes, they've of course already come into the foster home with a history of trauma that then will contribute to their, unfortunately, to their vulnerability to traffickers. So who are domestic victims? Here are some of the primary vulnerabilities for trafficking for US children. And being in foster care is the top vulnerability for children in the US territory. And it's important to remember, as I said before, that this population is going to have a history of sexual and or physical trauma or both. Other risk factors include family dysfunction, a family member or peer who's in sex work or prostitution, domestic family violence, drug use, poor school performance, and these down here, which we talk about less, that I will talk about a little bit more because I think desire for love and belonging, need for acceptance, these are themes that really come up in treatment when you start working with people who have had these experiences. I'm not going to go through this whole slide, and I put it in here so that you could have access to this information. But what I wanted to highlight here is what this slide, and this is from Reed's work, is showing are it's the list of vulnerabilities that contribute to somebody being more vulnerable to human trafficking. And what I wanted to point out is that I just said a moment ago that for people in the United States, in the US territory, the leading vulnerability, especially for kids, is being in the foster care system. Internationally, the leading vulnerability, so think of people being brought to the US from other countries, is familial poverty. That's the leading vulnerability for international victims of human trafficking. And then I will leave this slide for all of you to look at, and you can compare which one are the shared, where do vulnerabilities overlap for these two groups and where do they differ. You can also see that in structural factors, armed conflict and political instability, followed closely by natural disasters, are major vulnerabilities. And for a lot of you, I'm sure that resonates with some of the people that you're working with. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about resilience as a push factor. So there are these risk factors, and then these other longings, desire for love, need for acceptance, desire for a better life, ambition, that become push factors that drive children and youth who are suffering abuse and neglect to run from their homes. And when they run, they're hoping for love, but more often than not, unfortunately, these kids that run become stuck in situations where they're exploited by others. And so, these are kids who are hoping for love, and what they end up running into experiences of exploitation. And let me move along here. So I'm going to go back for a moment to an important fact about who traffickers are. With regards to organization, the United Nations, they created a very useful breakdown of range of trafficking operations. So as you can see, it moves from small local to medium sub-regional and to large transnational operations. And in the movies, what we see are trafficking operations that look more like what is described of large transnational operations. But in reality, most US domestic cases of human trafficking are run as small local operations that involve one or few traffickers, a small number of victims, intimate partner exploitation, and limited investment and profits. This would also be true of operations within Guatemala, for instance, that I know more about because I've worked there, and I would say it's probably consistent throughout the region of Central America and the Caribbean and Mexico as well. Sometimes there will be overlap between trafficking and drug operations. I'm not saying that those don't exist, but they're less common. What's most common are these small local operations. And so how do these small local traffickers carry out their trafficking? So who is a trafficker? And a good way to think about this is that a trafficker is someone who's very good at befriending a vulnerable person. And it can be a boyfriend, it can be a female friend, a peer, or an older woman that is experienced as helpful. It can be an abusive or exploitative caregiver. It can also be a fraudulent front or a modeling agency. I worked on one case that was a labor trafficking case, a large labor trafficking case of young people who were trafficked. These were young people, recent college graduates, about 100 of them from the Philippines and the Dominican Republic, and they were all recruited through a fraudulent front. A company that was offering to bring young people who had recently graduated from, who had recently gotten certificates, associate's degrees in hotel management, to come to the United States and work in hotels. And it was a fraudulent front with the intention of exploiting people. And they were able to exploit these young people for a period of about, I think it was about 3 to 4 years. And they made millions of dollars in profit from the particular way in which they were able to exploit these young people. And so these traffickers were very, very skilled at engaging these young people, talking to them in a way that the young people would respond, getting them really excited about some of the ambitions that they could finally fulfill by following these people to the United States. And what they found once they got here was just a pretty terrible situation. So about recruitment, what the methods. So what are some of the methods that traffickers will use? I already started to talk about this. Their objective initially is just to gather a lot of information. And then they gather this information to then use it to deceive the person that they're trying to deceive, and to deceive the person into believing that they're a friend. So wherever the victim or the person who's being victimized is experiencing a basic need, what the trafficker does is that they offer help. And so all of the people that I've evaluated had some kind of a vulnerability that stood out, which the trafficker addressed. And with that, they gained the victim's trust. So I recall one young woman who talked about having to take care of a caregiver who had developed a terminal illness. And he was befriended by a trafficker who for several years sold this young man online. And the trafficker kept most of the boy's earnings. And this boy, feeling damaged by his experience, began to abuse drugs. He lived on the streets. Related to recruitment, Sandy Pierce did a study with American Indian girls and identified that women and girls described male and female pimps as using something that they termed finesse pimping methods to lure American Indian girls off the reservation into the city. And so these methods included things like telling girls that they're beautiful, that they should try modeling or being a dancer, offering road trips or shopping trips to the city, offering to take care of them with a free place to stay, buying them jewelry and clothing, and generally just making them feel really special. In other words, in these cases, the trafficker is meeting a person's unfulfilled needs for love and affection. And in recruitment for international trafficking, I just wanted to bring your attention to some other factors because these are important. Also, international, there traffickers will vulnerable they'll make false national traffickers. They're also going to be people, false promises. They'll use the relationship to get the person to do, and culture. That's true both for later on. That's the second. Know that this isn't happening, but in the victim is fully will do if natural sexual objective is that they have made that the person, the victim, has made a choice about their exploitation. So I recall one woman explaining to me that when she met her trafficker, he told her that he had a couple of $1,000 to spend on her to get her back on her feet. So she said that what she understood that relationship to her trafficker as an intimate relationship, that he was her boyfriend. However, after his money ran out, he began to force her to prostitute. And when she resisted, he reminded her that he had told her that he only had $2,000, and that because she had accepted to let him spend the money on her, she knew from the beginning that it meant that once the money ran out, she would have to work, prostitute for him to earn it back. And so that is what happened, and that led to multiple years of being caught up in prostitution. She developed a drug addiction. She became very depressed, attempted to kill herself a couple of times, and it was very hard for her to then leave. So you might be thinking, wow, this sounds a lot like domestic violence, and it would make sense if that's what you're thinking. Because strong overlaps actually do exist between the dynamics of sex trafficking and domestic violence. This is from Rose Sipovit and colleagues' study. The graph is in their article. And I think it's the most comprehensive article on this issue of the overlaps between sex trafficking and domestic violence. So when you may right now already be working with with somebody who's had an experience of trafficking, that understand their experience more under the guise of domestic violence. And so it's a confusing distinction to make, because both include violence, grooming, secrecy, psychological abuse and instability, dominance and power and rules. But sex trafficking is additionally characterized by exploitation, by stigma, by participation in a unique subculture, by victimization, by people outside of that primary relationship that don't help or assist victims, and by sexual activity outside of the primary relationship. And we've already talked about I've already talked to you about many of these throughout the presentation. So traumatic bonding, it applies to both domestic and international. Transit applies primarily to international. And these become very strong, very strong push factors, very contributing factors to keeping somebody in a place where they can be exploited by the trafficker. First of all, when people are traveling with a human smuggler, sometimes that human smuggler will sell that person to a human trafficker. The person would not know that that has happened. Documents are seized. This takes away a great amount of control from people. Just think for a moment about not having your documents for a whole week. Think for a moment that you couldn't have access to your driver's license. It would disrupt your life significantly. You have to stop and think about it, because we don't really think about it, because for most of us, and I know I'm making an assumption here, but I'm assuming that for most of us, we haven't had to deal in a continuous way with not having our fundamental identity documents, right? So, I mean, some of you might have, but if you haven't, it's hard to know what kind of effect that can have on your life. And so it's really during the transit phase, during the experience of transit, that the dependence on the trafficker begins. And people are, if you've heard people talk about the trip from different parts of Latin America to the United States, they're really at the mercy of smugglers, of corrupt local authorities. Rapes and assaults are frequent, unfortunately. And then this is where traffickers begin an indoctrination and breaking in. You owe me your life. See, if it weren't for me, you would have gotten raped just like everyone else. So now you have to do what I tell you to do. And you didn't pay me enough for your transit, so now you're going to have to work to pay me for your transit, and I'm going to decide when you're done paying your debt. So and people are both deeply traumatized by the experience of transit and don't really have all of their resources available to defend themselves from this kind of manipulation and coercion. And so the traffickers' methods are a combination of deceit, coercion that can be physical or psychological, and use of force. And the objective is preparing to be able to force the person into commercial sex or into other forms of forced labor, and for the person to learn what is expected and what are the consequences for non-compliance. And for international people, once they reach the US and they realize what's happened to them, or once they realize that they're being exploited, or that they're being controlled, isolated, that they're trapped into a situation, it's a reaction of a lot of shock, disorientation, and all of this will lead to the person not being able to reach out for help. And I emphasize this because a lot of times I hear people say, but if they were in that situation, why didn't they just ask for help? It's far more complicated because the trafficker tactics are all designed to decrease the possibility of the person actually reaching out for help. For international people, intimidation and threats with immigration, the police, or actually also reaching out to family and shaming the person become very effective ways of keeping people under the trafficker's control. And so trafficking looks like, in other words, the trafficker's methods of manipulation, physical and psychological coercion, make it look like the person is a willing participant in the relationship, and that the person has agreed to this situation of exploitation. So psychological coercion makes the victim invisible, and invisibility is further maintained by the trafficker tactics, so the feigned relationship that makes it look like DV, the structural factors, societal stigma, which contributes to shame, and that leads to further isolation. And so some of the consequences of psychological coercion, of mistrust and shame, of people who've been subjected to this kind of experience, they'll present with classical PTSD-like symptoms of trauma. So think hypervigilance, states of hyperarousal, difficulty sleeping, and general challenges with their ability to regulate and cope. However, more often than not, the most prominent consequence of human trafficking is going to be in the relational sphere. So for the person who survived trafficking, the internal narrative is going to go something like this: I hoped, and I trusted the trafficker, and that trust was broken when all the promises that were made to me were broken by the trafficker, and instead I was abused and exploited. The consequence post-trafficking then is a deep sense of mistrust and also shame. Shame because she or he or they were made to feel psychologically manipulated by the trafficker into believing that they chose to be exploited. And so now that message is reinforced, unfortunately, socially, by messaging that rejects people who have been involved in any way, shape, or form in the sex industry, or people who are in the US with an undefined immigration status. So you see how all of these issues begin to overlap. And so post-identification victim responses, therefore, are still lacking to fully address these complex issues that people who have had these experiences are struggling with. So typically what happens for youth in the United States, and this applies both to Latino and non-Latino youth, is that they're identified by social services or law enforcement. They may be arrested for engaging in a variety of delinquent behaviors that their traffickers coerce them to participate in. And this includes cities that are arresting people who are prostituting. After the person is apprehended, she or he is typically provided with non-specialized services. And so the person will run again, the young person will run again. And then if she's apprehended, she's going to be placed into a more restrictive setting that, if it's not accompanied by specialized services, it's only going to further decrease trust in providers. Because the main and unaddressed issue in most of these cases is that systems and providers fail to recognize that this is a person, a minor sometimes, who will likely continue to be locked into a traumatic bond with the trafficker. The trafficker has created that traumatic bond. And it's been instituted primarily through the trafficker's use of manipulation and psychological coercion. The interventions to address the consequences of this dynamic will have to be relational, not behavioral. I am not saying that there isn't room to do behavioral work. It is also necessary, but it has to be complemented with robust relational work. And so most of the inpatient residential programs that are available to youth, they're largely behaviorally focused. This trend is also true of services for adults who have had these experiences of trafficking. So what is lacking is our relationally based interventions that can counter the traumatic bond. And so a lot of the research that I've been trying to do has been focused on responding to this question: what kind of relational response can we provide to help break this cycle? I wanted to give you quickly just an example of a case that so that you can see some of the cultural overlaps that can play in coercion in trafficking. So this person was prosecuted. This was not a case that I directly worked on. This was a case that a colleague worked on. So this is second-hand case material, and also this is material that is available publicly. It was covered in the press. So this person, Jorge Flores Rojas, he picked up vans full of 8 to 10 young women each week from other smugglers or traffickers. Others he smuggled in directly from Latin America. Now, this would still be considered a small local operation. He favored teenagers because he could charge more for them. And the men would pay $25 to $30 for 15 minutes of sex with one of these girls that he trafficked. Teenagers would be made to have sex with up to 100 men a week. So you do the math to see how much money this person was making. And then he had them pray to Santa Muerte, which is the patron saint of death in Mexico, who is said to protect pimps and other criminals. And so to keep a fresh cycle of women, these were actually his words, Flores traded with traffickers, including relatives in surrounding major cities. He sold girls to a madam in another major city. Then he abducted the madam's teenage daughter, assaulted her, trafficked her, and that's when the madam called authorities. So actually, if that hadn't happened, it's very likely that all of these girls would have never come to the attention of local authorities, and this man would have never been prosecuted. What he did was, and this was the girl gave, the madam's daughter gave a report about this, he stuffed her underwear in a small glass vase on his shrine, made her pray with him to the Santa Muerte, and told her, if you run away, the saint will punish you. Many times in this kind of case, there are also drugs involved. Victims will not know that they are being drugged by the trafficker. And so I have worked on cases where people were very likely fed with hallucinogenic substances and then subjected to this kind of experience, which can become a very, very powerful way of keeping somebody in a state of fear and of preventing them from running away. And so this was back in 2008. ICE agents, they stormed Flores's apartment. He wasn't there. He was arrested the next day in another city where he had brought some of the victims because they had been overused where he lived. So he was afraid of being caught. In April of 2009, he pled guilty to sex trafficking involving a minor. He was sentenced to 24 years, was ordered to pay $117,000, which is nothing, in restitution to one of the victims. And he was required to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. He's currently in a federal prison and will be deported to Mexico upon his release from prison. The madam who pleaded guilty to transporting individuals for prostitution, was sentenced to time served, and she was going to be deported to Honduras. And the DC madam's daughter was living with a foster family. She was going to receive a special immigrant juvenile visa, and she wanted to go to college and be a lawyer. Two other girls that were found with Flores at the time of his arrest, they were also placed with foster families, and social services had arranged medical care, new clothes for them, were trying to meet their needs, take care of them. And ICE was trying to help facilitate and arranging work permits for them. But before the permits arrived, the girls disappeared, and they were actually never found. Nobody knows what happened to them. So, I point that out, not to, I don't want to depress you all, but I do want to highlight how much in sharp contrast the reality of what happens to people who've had this experience are, and so why it's so important for us to be really knowledgeable about what really happens, and to be able to work with people from that place of knowledge that most people who've had this experience will have a very hard time staying in services. My best guess of what happened with these young girls is that the amount of shame that they felt and the lack of community connections that they had made it really hard for them to be able to stay, get the services that they needed, and resource themselves more to really pull out of these horrible experiences that they had with this trafficker. I just wanted to just also say that right now, with the COVID crisis and trafficking, there is evidence that, with increased isolation, decreased safety networks, increasing financial strain and poverty, there's certainly been some indicators that there's a greater vulnerability to human trafficking. For international people who've been provided with temporary immigration documents or time-limited services linked to their status as victims of trafficking, some of them haven't been able to renew them easily because of all the backlog that we have in all of our systems because of COVID. And situations have also worsened as borders have been closed, and planned repatriations, for instance, can't take place. And people aren't having the same amount of access to healthcare that they had in the past, and some social benefits have already expired. So shelters also closed, I know, at the very beginning of the pandemic, and that put a lot of people in pretty vulnerable situations. So something to think about. Some of the gaps that we're working with are, the inconsistent definition of trafficking that I talked about a lot, reduced ability that we have to screen and identify still, very limited data on prevalence, although this has gotten better. I have more recent citations that from 2018, 2019, showing that we are getting better at collecting prevalence data, and that should also help improve distribution of funds for services, but also have limited fund specialized services for and treatment for victims. And what we know about promising interventions is that trauma-informed treatments are definitely in order to stabilize symptoms and build coping. Relationally focused approaches that build trust are very important. Peer supportive services as well that build trust. I didn't talk about peer supportive services. I could actually do with some of my colleagues a whole presentation on that, because I do work with a lot of peers who help pull people out of situations of trafficking. And much like what happened in substance abuse work, in domestic violence work, where peer intervention has been crucial to addressing those issues, it's no different in human trafficking. We need peers to be heavily involved in identifying people who are victims of human trafficking, bringing them into treatment, and helping us treat them as well. Multidisciplinary approaches are important. that address the multiple presenting concerns that I talked about, and also interventions that work within an ecological and human rights frame that attend to the whole person, that recognize the multiple sociocultural, contextual issues that contribute to human trafficking. So in conclusion, human trafficking isn't an isolated issue, but it's complex and layered. It's important to develop a greater understanding about consequences of psychological coercion through research and use the knowledge to develop specialized services. Increased awareness about the negative impact that stigma towards people who are in commercial sex has in the fight against human trafficking. Also, I think it's important to think about campaigns to increase empathic concern towards all people who participate in commercial sex. And efforts to address the structural and contextual issues that contribute to human trafficking are also important. And so what, this is what I propose is also that in our definition of human trafficking, we use a historical, a psychosocial historical definition of trafficking, where we recognize that it's rooted in some of the same social issues that for over 2 centuries fueled the institution of slavery in the American continent, not just in the United States, that today's human traffickers use sophisticated and often hard to detect forms of physical and or psychological coercion to exploit another. And the human trafficking can also be hard to detect when it hides in the legal and illegal sex industries and other forms of labor where workers are vulnerable to isolating societal stigma that facilitates exploitation. In this presentation, I will also leave you with links to validated human trafficking screening tools. For those of you who work with an international population, I highly recommend the Vera Institute's Human Trafficking Screening Form. They also have excellent guidelines as to how you can use these instruments. There's the Adult Human Trafficking Screening Tool provided by HHS, by the US Department of Health and Human Services. And then there's also the Human Trafficking Screening for Homeless Young Adults. This one's especially good for domestic populations that was developed by Mount Sinai Hospital, Covenant House, and the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Massachusetts. So that's what I have for you all today. Here are my references, and now I'm going to open it up for questions. And thank you so much for being here and listening. And please, anything that's on your mind, I'd love to talk with you.
Thank you, Dr. Contreras, for a wonderful presentation. We do actually have a couple questions, so I'm going to go ahead and share them with you.
Okay.
Does human trafficking, torture have anything to do with the perpetrator's philosophy of life, or is it a psychological and commercial process, or both?
So I guess what the participant is asking about is what drives the trafficker. I didn't really get into that. It's an excellent question because there is data, there is research showing that traffickers are socialized into trafficking. You will see it more commonly referred to as the pimping culture. And so there are networks of families, for instance, and I'll talk to you about Mexico and Guatemala. There are family networks where the family's business is the business of trafficking. And so in those families, especially the boys, will be taught how to be effective traffickers by other men in the family, and also sometimes by the mother or other women in the family who also participate in the trafficking of other people. And I think That is the second part of that question was the philosophy, and then the other one was about the market, I think, right?
Commercial process.
Yeah, and so then the commercial process, of course, also plays a role, and I think you can understand that from the perspective of incentive. That once you know, a person has been taught how to be a trafficker, if they try to be a trafficker and they find it to be profitable, they're more likely to continue doing it because they're incentivized by the money that they're making. And then, you know, of course, I also want to point out that this is not the only way that traffickers become traffickers. And then the third thing that I'll say is that some studies done by people who work on this issue in the Department of Justice in the US, what they have found is that amongst people with psychopathic tendency, this group has very, very high psychopathic tendency. So on the Hare psychopathy scale, for instance, they score very high. What's concerning is that high psychopathy coupled with high intelligence, very charismatic, meaning they're very, very capable of befriending people. So the idea that you would see a trafficker and you would find the person scary is probably not true. You could have a friend who's a trafficker and you wouldn't know that they're a trafficker, and you might even think that that person is a really nice, thoughtful person.
Thank you so much. The next question we have is more of a legal question, I think. So let me know. Does the state, and in this question they're putting in parentheses Florida, prosecute panderers without the need for testimony from the victim?
If they prosecute who?
It says panderers.
Uh-huh. So I guess maybe people who are being forced to pander.
It doesn't specify, but I would think so.
Yeah, I wouldn't know about that. That would go beyond my knowledge base.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I'm sorry.
That's
Yeah.
why I mentioned it's more of a legal question. Okay, so this is another question. Any recommendations or examples about relational approaches with clients who have experienced human trafficking?
Yes. So I think especially in the initial stages of working with someone who's had this experience, build trust. Everything that we know about building a strong therapeutic alliance, that's what you want to pay attention to. Something that I'll emphasize is you do not need them to talk to you about the experience of trafficking for you to begin to work therapeutically with them. Why I say this is because we tend to get so focused on, you know, when people get a referral and in the referral the word trafficking appears, as providers, we understandably become very focused on that. You know that something really big has happened to this person. My recommendation is that in order for, and you know, this comes from the you know, this is really 101 trauma sensitive work, is you don't need the narrative, meaning you don't want to ask people questions that'll make them feel like they have to start talking to you about things that they're not ready to talk with you about yet. So in order to start to be relationally focused, the place where I start with people is, what do you need right now? And what do you want to get out of this work? And it's really interesting. Hardly ever will people say to me, oh, I really need to talk to you about what that trafficker did to me. But they will say, I can't sleep and I really need some help sleeping because it's been weeks and maybe I've slept 3 hours a night. And so I start working with people on those issues. Or I I think I might be evicted from where I'm living right now and I don't know what to do. Okay, let's work on that. So, it can seem at the beginning, if you're a therapist, for instance, it can seem at the beginning like you're not really doing therapeutic work. You are building, by addressing those issues, the therapeutic alliance. That therapeutic alliance is what will let you do deeper relational work with people later on. And so then I'm trained as a psychoanalyst as well. So some of the issues that I start to pay attention to, I don't, of course, I don't use psychoanalysis in the traditional way. So I don't want you to think about Freud and a couch. Um, but I do use some of the constructs that are very helpful, especially the constructs of transference, countertransference. Countertransference, what I use it for is to understand what reactions I'm having to the people I'm working with, because sometimes those reactions can make it hard for me to continue to engage with the person. So I think a lot about what does it take for me as a provider to remain engaged, to stay present, um, and to be in the kind of state of mind that we need to be in as providers to be helpful to the people that we work with. And transference, I apply it as an understanding of how is the person experiencing me. And the deeper you get into work with people who've had these experiences, there will always be a moment where they're going to feel like you are trying to control them. And when that happens, I take it very seriously, because I know that something about their past experiences is coming up in the room with me. And so rather than saying, no, no, wait a minute, I'm a nice person, I'm like, I get it. You're experiencing me right now as someone who could harm you, and I'm going to take that very seriously, and we're going to try to get to the bottom of it. And so there's a number of things that I might do with that, but there I'm really talking to you what starts to happen later on in the work when you've been able to, in those, I would say, in those first 8 to 12 sessions, build a very strong therapeutic alliance with the person where you're focused on what they need from the work.
Thank you. Great. Um, we have another question. How can an individual or a professional such as a social worker follow up on a suspected trafficking case without re-traumatizing the victim, especially if the victim identifies as a sex worker?
So I think it's very important, especially if you're working with adults. I'll talk about work with adults because with children, it's different, of course. With children, if you're working in the US territory, you have mandated reporting obligations. So there's really there's no wiggle room there. With adults, it's very important that your focus be on continuing to engage the person rather than reporting what you're understanding, what you've identified as a crime. Why? Because if you report and the police come to that person, 99% possible that the person is going to deny that anything that you've reported to the authorities is happening. The authorities can do absolutely nothing with a report from you if they don't have um, a victim who is willing to participate in a prosecution. So what you've done as a provider, if you report prematurely, I'm not saying that there's never room to report, but if you report prematurely, what you've done maybe is bar that person from continuing to work with you. So I know, we get very roused up with this kind of information. It's very hard to be working with someone that you know is being victimized and to feel like you can't do anything about it. That's what countertransference is. And that's my jargon. That's what I understand it as countertransference when I'm feeling that. And so what I try to do when I'm experiencing that is I talk with the person and I tell them something like, I'm hearing that some really bad stuff is happening to you, and I want to keep hearing about this. And I want you to tell me when and if you ever want to involve a third party to help you with this, like the police. When I say something like that, usually people will say to me something like, if you call the police, I am never coming back here again. Sometimes even by saying that, people don't trust coming back to me anymore. So you see, it's really, you really have to leave it up to the person to decide when they're going to make a report. And here I'm talking about people that are coming to see you somewhere in your office, in a community health center, in a hospital. They're mobile and they're out and about. Now, if I'm working with someone and they leave me a message and they tell me that they're being abused and that they need help, I'm going to take that as permission to involve the third party. In that case, I would probably call 911 or try to get them some kind of third party assistance. The last thing that I'll say is that you can contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline through the Polaris Project website. You can find the information to call that number, and you can make an anonymous report about a suspected case of trafficking. As a concerned citizen, you can do that. But I would really, I would really talk to a supervisor. I would really consult with colleagues to decide when and if I'm going to involve a third party in those situations where it's more gray, like the one that I just described.
Thank you so much. You also answered another question, and that was if there is a hotline that people can access regarding human trafficking.
Yes. Yeah, the Polaris Project website is an excellent resource. And you can find all the phone numbers, and you can also, I believe, submit a tip anonymously through their website.
Okay, perfect. We have time for one more question. What do you, where is it? With the current crisis at the Texas border, do you know if anyone is screening individuals to make sure they are not victims of human sex trafficking?
I mean, our federal authorities should be. I don't have knowledge if they actually are. I wouldn't have access to that information. But anyone who is, any NGO, any nonprofit organization, or any health service providing organization, legal organization, of course, typically anyone who's close to the border, working in that area, they would be screening for human trafficking. That's pretty routine at this point, fortunately. We're at that place. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we don't have time for more questions. So again, on behalf of the National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, we would like to thank you, Dr. Contreras, for a wonderful presentation. And hopefully we'll be able to do a second session where we dive into the relational aspects of the intervention. Again, I want to remind our participants to please complete our evaluation. I've shared the link for the evaluation via chat a couple of times during the presentation. I'm going to do that once again. We appreciate you taking the time to participate in this webinar, and hopefully we'll see you soon at our next session. So thank you very much. Take care. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon. Bye.
Bye.